5 reading week 2. Today, this week we've been asked to scan through a couple of the pages to look at some characteristics of Matt. And we're going to be filling out the triangle which you'll find on page 21 of your student book. Now, to help me scan, I find it easier to actually photocopy the pages out of the book and then highlight the phrases which to me have a bearing on what we've been asked to do. And that's what I've done. So I've highlighted the first 2 pages to actually go through and give you an idea of how we might fill out this form. So we're looking for things to do with Matt. And so what I have highlighted is Matt stood at the edge of the clearing in the very first sentence, and then after that his father had gone. There was a chance that his father might turn back, but his father had really gone. He was alone. He turned to look back at the log cabin that he had helped to build every inch of. He cut down the spruce trees, hauled the logs, squared and notched them, and then raised them up. He'd climbed on the roof and fixed it. He then mounded up the corn. He then looked at the mound of corn that he'd helped to plant, and the pumpkin vines. And that's all found there on page 1. On page 2, I highlighted the things like he'd been alone before. His father had often gone out into the forest to hunt. He was not much of a talker. They'd worked together side by side without speaking a single word. But this silence was different. He knew it was high time for his father to start back. They were the first settlers. As such, they'd had a passage on the ship. They'd needed to strike out by foot. They needed to clear ground, to plant corn. He was waiting for his mother, sister and newborn baby, and they were still quite a while. He had to guard the cabin and the corn patch, and he went to bed with every muscle in his body aching. So those were the things that I highlighted, and then from those we should be able to come up with a characteristic or some of the characteristics of Matt. So in our triangle, the very first thing that we need to do, it says there at the top to put in the name of the person. So the name of the person we're looking at is Matt. The next one then is physical appearances that we know of from our passage so far that we can write in about Matt. Well, one of the things that we know of is that he is strong. He's also quiet. But we also know that he is a young boy. And those were the only things that I could think of having read those first 2 pages. From those first 2 pages we know what his role was. His role was to guard the cabin and the plot of land they owned. Until the family came back. And then it asked for any of the problems that he had had, or any of the challenges that he'd had in those first 2 pages. If I look at those first 2 pages, one of the first problems that's listed there on page 1 is that they had to build a log cabin. And to do that, they needed to then clear land And in clearing land, they also then made a veggie patch. So those were the ones that I found on the first page. But on the second page, we also realised that he had survived a trip from Quincy, Massachusetts, I hope I spelled that right, probably not, I'll have to look at that later, to where they were living in Maine. And that was first by boat, then by a little rowboat, and then the walk to where they lived. And all of that was, of course, in 1768 in America. So you think back, they didn't have speedboats like we have today, they didn't have cars, so all of that had to be done. And the same goes for his building of the log cabin. He didn't have a chainsaw, he had to use an axe. Okay, so then his achievements were very similar. In fact, I would say his achievements and his challenges were the same sort of things. He survived, that's an achievement for a young boy to do at his at that time. He had to build a log cabin, so he had to be strong to be able to do that, and that meant he'd be swinging an axe every day until the trees were done, notching out the little notches so that the logs would lay over one on top of the other with very little gap between, and even then filling up the gaps later. Clearing the land is not just chopping down the trees, they also had to then pull out the tree stumps, and in doing so it helped to get the veggie patch ready. So there are also, each one of these, so survival, cabin, clear land, and veggie patch are also the major achievements that I could see in those first two pages. Now, in step 2 and in step 3, you are then asked to read, go from page 2 to page 10 and see if you can then add other characteristics that you find along the way into there. You may scan differently than I did, but that's alright. What we're trying to find out is, what can we do, how can we build up a picture of who Matt was? If we look at the back cover tells us that he was only 12 years old. And I think in page 3 or 4 it tells us that his birthday is coming up in August when he'll be 13. So that helps to build up our picture of Matt. Have a go, see how you get on.